He slapped me so hard my head hit the chair. It was Thanksgiving dinner and everyone was there. My father's hand landed across my face like it was routine, like it was normal, like it was dessert after the turkey. And they laughed. Not a burst of nervous laughter, not the kind that slips out when people don't know what to do. It was amused casual, even condescending. My brother Dean smirked into his beer. My other brother Kyle said, "She asked for it, Dad." My mother poured herself another glass of wine without lifting her eyes from the table. I sat there blinking through the sting, feeling the warmth rise to my cheek and the shame settle like cement in my bones. I was 25. I was still living in the house I grew up in, still being told what to do, still being hit when I didn't comply. That night, something cracked. It didn't shatter. It didn't explode. It just cracked quietly like a hairline fracture under pressure. 15 years later, I came back. Not for revenge. Not for reconciliation. I came back with a pen, a bank transfer, and a deed. I came back to buy the house where they still lived. My name is Rachel. I am 41 years old, and for the first 25 years of my life, I lived under one roof with a man who believed fear was the same as love. My father, Frank, was a retired Marine who never truly left the battlefield. He brought the war home with him tucked into his boots and folded into the creases of his jaw. He believed in obedience, silence, and structure. He believed daughters were meant to listen, not speak. My mother, Linda, had learned long ago how to disappear while standing in plain sight. Her coping mechanism was surrender. She poured tea and agreed with everything he said. Her favorite phrase was, "He just wants what's best for you." I heard that so many times it became background noise. I was the youngest of three. My brothers, Dean and Kyle, were golden boys athletes and loudmouths full of jokes and backslaps and the kind of confidence that grows in unchecked soil. They were never hit, never told to shut up. They left for college and came back with degrees and wives and stories while I stayed home. I wasn't allowed to apply to out-of-state schools. Frank said it wasn't safe, that I wasn't ready, that I would fail and embarrass the family. So I attended a local community college and studied accounting, even though what I really wanted was art. I sketched in secret in the margins of my textbooks on napkins, on the back of grocery receipts. My dream was to paint, to work in children's book illustration. But Frank said art was a hobby, not a job, and hobbies were for lazy people. I got my associate degree and a part-time job as a billing clerk at a small shipping company downtown. Every morning I made breakfast for Frank. Every evening I was home by 6. He said I didn't need friends. He said I had a family, and that should be enough. If I stayed out late, I got slapped. If I raised my voice, I got slapped. If I cried, I got mocked for being dramatic. I learned to swallow everything: anger, fear, dreams, even hunger. I shrank myself until I barely took up space. I dressed modestly, wore neutral tones, spoke softly. I became the kind of daughter who didn't provoke a slap, but still received them anyway. I wasn't even surprised when he hit me that Thanksgiving. I was used to it. But that night was different because of what came after. The laughter. That changed everything. They all laughed. Not one person looked shocked. Not one person said stop. It wasn't just Frank's hand that struck me. It was the collective shrug of a family that had always treated my pain as a nuisance. In that moment, I realized I had never truly been part of them. I had been tolerated, managed, kept around like an unwanted pet. Something inside me hardened. I didn't make a scene. I didn't scream or cry. I just got up from the table, cleared my plate, and washed it in the sink. I went to bed that night and stared at the ceiling for hours. And in the silence, I made a promise to myself. I didn't know when or how, but someday I would leave. And I would never ever come back unless I came back on my own terms. The slap at Thanksgiving wasn't the first, and it wasn't the last. It was just the one that broke something I didn't know I had left hope. After that night, I started to see things differently. The hallway I walked through every day suddenly looked smaller. The living room that held so many family photos felt like a museum of lies. I noticed how often Frank controlled everything, not just with his fists, but with his presence. The volume of the television, the meals we cooked, the shows we watched, the shoes we wore in the house. Everything passed through his filter of approval. Disapproval wasn't loud. It was a hand tightening around your wrist when no one was looking. It was a knock on your door at 11 p.m. because your light was still on. It was his chair in the living room, always empty, yet always claimed like a throne you didn't dare touch. My mother's voice grew quieter over the years, and eventually she only spoke to ask if we needed more potatoes or more bread. My brothers came and went bringing wives and eventually children, but their allegiance was always with him. They made fun of me for not moving out, not dating, not living. They thought I was weak. I let them think that. I didn't tell them that Frank had ripped the phone cord out of the wall when I tried to call the police at 16. I didn't tell them about the bruises I covered with long sleeves in July. I didn't tell them about the time he threw my sketchbooks in the fireplace and called them garbage. I just smiled when they joked and handed their kids juice boxes. I waited. I endured. But something had shifted in me. I started staying at work later. I volunteered for extra shifts. I saved every penny. I stopped buying new clothes. I packed sandwiches instead of buying lunch. I hid cash in a shoebox under my bed behind a pile of towels he never touched. I opened a secret savings account at a different bank, one he didn't know I used. I started reading personal finance blogs. I researched how to build credit, how to qualify for a loan, how to buy time without tipping your hand. I didn't know what I was working toward yet, but I knew I had to be ready. The moment came 3 months later. Frank called me into the living room one evening, handed me a pen, and pushed a folder toward me. "Sign this," he said. Inside was a quitclaim deed. He wanted me to sign over my portion of the house technically, since Mom had added my name to the deed years ago. I was part owner. Why, I asked. Because you don't do anything with it. You live here rent-free. You're not going to take care of it. You don't even know how. I told him I needed time to think. He slapped the folder shut and stood up. "You ungrateful little brat. We fed you, raised you, gave you everything. And now you want to fight me?" I didn't answer. That made him angrier. He raised his hand. My mother rushed in muttering something about calming down. He didn't hit me that night. But the message was clear. I was not allowed to own anything, not even my own space. I stayed up all night again. In the morning, before anyone woke, I packed a bag with a week's worth of clothes, my toothbrush, my shoebox of cash, and the few sketches I had left. I left a note on the kitchen table. "Don't contact me. I am safe. That's all you need to know." And then I walked out. I didn't have a car. I took the bus. I rode it 2 towns over and got off at a diner where a friend from work had offered her couch if I ever needed it. I did. I moved in with her for 3 weeks until I could afford a small studio apartment. It had peeling paint and smelled like mildew, but it was mine. No one told me what time to eat. No one banged on the walls. I could breathe. I cried the first night not from sadness, but from disbelief. I had done it. I had left. And for the first time in my life, no one followed. Living in that tiny studio apartment felt like standing on new legs after years of crawling. The floors creaked, the heater clicked loudly every 15 minutes. The window faced a brick wall. But it was my space. I didn't have to ask permission to hang a towel or cook after 8 p.m. I didn't have to eat dinner in silence while pretending not to flinch. For the first time, I could sit on the floor and draw, let my hair down, and just be still. But peace was not immediate. The ghosts followed me. I'd jump when I heard footsteps in the hallway. I panicked if I saw a car that looked like Frank's. I kept the chain lock on even when I was inside. I was free physically, but mentally I still carried his voice in my ears. "You'll never make it on your own. You're nothing without us. No one will take you seriously." It was like a song stuck on loop one I didn't know how to shut off. But I kept showing up. I kept going to work eating canned soup, sketching every night until my fingers cramped. I picked up side gigs doing tax prep. I took online classes on weekends to get certified in financial software. I wanted options. I needed them. Then one day, about 6 months after I left, I got a call from my mother. I didn't pick up. She left a voicemail. "Dad's in the hospital. Stroke. You should come." I didn't. Another voicemail. "The mortgage is behind. We might lose the house." I still didn't respond, but I listened. They thought I'd come running. They thought guilt was still strong enough to drag me back. It wasn't. I wasn't ready to face them. But something else began forming in my mind. I looked up the property records for their house. Sure enough, it had gone into pre-foreclosure. Frank's name was still on the deed. My name wasn't. I remembered the folder he tried to get me to sign. Maybe he had succeeded with my mother. Maybe she had handed over control. Either way, they were in trouble. I kept checking the county auction list. Their address didn't appear for months, but I kept watching. In the meantime, I kept building. I got a promotion at work, moved into a better apartment, started a blog under a pseudonym about surviving abusive families. I never named names, but women found it. They messaged me, they thanked me, they told me I wasn't alone. One reader was a woman named Naomi, who said my writing saved her from going back to her own father's house. That meant more than anything. One day, nearly 13 years after I had left, the address finally appeared. 614 Meadow Lane, my childhood home, set to be auctioned in 30 days. I took a breath. I called a real estate lawyer. I got pre-approved for a loan. I gathered every financial document I had, and then some. I didn't tell anyone, not even Naomi. On the day of the auction, I wore gray slacks and a navy blouse. I sat in the back, watched the bids open low. A few investors raised the price slowly. When it reached $20,000 below market value, I stepped in. My bid was firm, deliberate, and backed by decades of silence. I won. When the paperwork was signed and the keys were placed in my hand, I didn't cry. I felt something more powerful, closure beginning. I owned the house, the same one where Frank had told me I was nothing, the same kitchen where I had been slapped for speaking, the same dining room where they laughed while I bled. Now it was mine. But I didn't go there. Not yet. I waited until the eviction notice was formally served. My lawyer sent it. I didn't need to show up. I wasn't ready. They had 30 days to vacate. 2 weeks in, I got a call. Unknown number. I answered. It was Kyle. Is this a joke? He demanded. You bought the house. I didn't answer. You know Dad's still recovering, right? You're seriously gonna throw us out? I replied calmly. You have 2 weeks left. That's all. He cursed at me and hung up. I didn't mind. I was prepared for anger. What I wasn't prepared for came a week later. A letter, handwritten, from my mother. Inside it said, "We never thought you'd amount to anything, but I guess you proved us wrong. Please let us stay. We'll pay rent. Just don't throw us out." I read it twice. Then I folded it, placed it in a drawer, and said aloud to the empty room, "You should have stood up for me when I needed you." I didn't respond. They moved out 3 days before the deadline. My lawyer confirmed it. The house was empty. I walked in the following week. The front door creaked like it always did. The living room smelled like dust and resentment. I stood in the center of the kitchen. It was smaller than I remembered. I walked to the dining room. The chair I had been hid in was still there. Same wood, same cushion. I sat in it, faced the spot where Frank had once stood. Then I whispered, "Not anymore." After I bought the house, I didn't move in right away. I rented it out for a year. I didn't want to live in a place where every corner held a bruise. Instead, I moved to a quiet town 3 hours away and bought a modest 2-bedroom condo near the lake. It had big windows, white walls, and nothing that reminded me of my past. I painted again, not just sketches, but full canvases. I framed them and hung them up. I even sold a few at a local art market. People said they felt something in the brushstrokes, grief maybe, or peace. I didn't correct them. I took long walks in the morning. I got a dog. I made friends, real ones. People who didn't laugh when I spoke. People who didn't flinch at the word no. I dated briefly, but learned quickly that I didn't need anyone to validate my space. I loved the silence now. It wasn't empty. It was safe. I kept working, kept saving. Financially, I was more stable than I had ever been. But it wasn't about the money. It was about having the freedom to choose what mattered. I started volunteering at a local shelter for women who'd escaped domestic violence. I didn't share my story unless they asked. But when they did, I told it plainly. No embellishment, just truth. And they listened not with pity, but with understanding. One of them, a woman named Teresa, said I thought I was the only one who'd been slapped in front of a whole room. and had no one say anything. I looked at her and said, "You're not." I began to see how many of us carried the same shame, the same silence, the same invisible scars. And I realized something important surviving wasn't enough. Thriving was the real revenge. I visited the old house once during the rental, just to check in. The tenants were a young couple with a toddler. They had painted the walls pale yellow and installed a swing set in the backyard. I smiled when I saw it. A house that once held screams now held laughter. That mattered to me. After their lease ended, I debated selling. But I wasn't ready. Not yet. I had one more thing I needed to do. I waited until spring, then I drove back alone. No announcement, no ceremony. Just me, the keys, and a quiet resolve. I stepped into the house again, this time without fear. I opened the windows. I lit candles. I walked every room and said goodbye to each memory, not with hate, but with finality. In the basement, I found old boxes with my name on them. One held my high school sketchbook, somehow not burned. Another had a baby blanket I hadn't seen in decades. I kept those. The rest I threw out. I stood in the dining room again, placed my palm on the wall, where I once leaned after being hit, and whispered, "This is over." Then I called a contractor. I wanted to remodel, not to erase the past, but to claim it on my own terms. We took out the old cabinets, replaced the cracked tiles, turned the dining room into an art studio. I painted one wall crimson red bold and unapologetic. The house didn't feel like his anymore. It felt like mine. I held the deed. I signed every check. I made every decision. The space that once made me feel small now echoed only my voice. And it was enough. A few months after the renovations were complete, I received a letter postmarked from my old town. The handwriting was unmistakably my mother's. It was short. "We heard you remodeled the house. Your father isn't well. If there's any decency left in you, you'll let us visit." I didn't reply. A week later, a message arrived in my inbox through the contact form on my art blog. It was from Dean, my older brother. "You bought the house just to humiliate us, didn't you? You always were dramatic." That made me laugh. I hadn't laughed about anything related to them in years. But the idea that they thought I did any of this for them, that my entire journey had been built on their shadows, was hilarious. No, I didn't rebuild my life to get revenge. I rebuilt it because I deserved to live. Because they didn't get to define my worth anymore. Still, something in me felt unfinished. I had never seen them since I left. Never stood face to face with the people who had made me feel disposable. I didn't need closure, but I wanted them to see who I had become. So I planned a showing, an open house. I printed invitations and mailed them, one to each of them. No note, just the invite. Open house at 614 Meadow Lane, Sundays 2 p.m. I set up refreshments, hung my latest paintings in the newly converted art studio, and left the front door open. The first to arrive was Kyle. He looked thinner, older, unsure. He stood in the foyer like he didn't recognize the place. "You did all this?" he asked. I nodded. He glanced at the kitchen, the new counters, the floors. "Looks good," he muttered. Dean came next with his wife, who didn't speak. Then my mother. She looked around like she was walking through a stranger's house. Last was Frank, in a wheelchair pushed by a nurse. His face was slack on one side from the stroke. He didn't say anything, but his eyes roamed the room, taking in every change, every new color, every trace of a life he hadn't built. I didn't say much. I let the house speak. Let the art on the walls do the talking. Let the polished wood and fresh paint and open windows show them what I had done with the place they once controlled. No one laughed. Not this time. They stayed for less than 20 minutes. When they left, none of them looked me in the eye. I didn't mind. I hadn't invited them for a reunion. I had invited them to witness something simple and undeniable. I was still standing. And now, I owned the ground they once stood on. 2 days after the open house, I received a knock on my door. It was my mother. She was alone, no suitcase, no purse, just her hands clasped in front of her like she was holding something invisible. "Can I come in?" she asked. I hesitated, then nodded. We sat in the living room. She looked around again like she couldn't quite place herself in this version of the house. "It's beautiful," she said softly. "I never thought you'd do something like this." I didn't answer. She shifted in her seat. "Your father's not doing well. The stroke left him different. He doesn't remember everything. Doesn't remember that night." I raised an eyebrow. "That's convenient." She flinched. "Rachel," she said, voice tightening, "I know we made mistakes." "Mistakes?" I repeated. "You call it a mistake to watch your husband slap your daughter in front of an entire family dinner and pour yourself another glass of wine like nothing happened." Her eyes welled, but I wasn't moved. "You could have stopped him." "You didn't." "I was scared," she whispered. "He was so angry always. I thought if I stayed quiet, he'd calm down. I didn't know what else to do." "You were his wife," I said. "You had power I didn't. But you chose silence. Again and again." She nodded slowly. "You're right. And I live with that every day." The room was quiet for a while. The sound of the breeze through the new windows filled the space. "Why are you here?" I asked finally. "Do you want me to forgive you? Do you want to move back in?" "No," she said quickly. "God, no. I wanted you to know I'm proud of you. I never told you that. I never thought you'd leave. And when you did, I was so angry. But not because you left, because you did what I couldn't." I felt something shift inside me. Not forgiveness, but recognition. The kind that comes when someone finally names what was unspoken for decades. "What did Dad say after the open house?" I asked. She looked away. "Nothing. He hasn't spoken much since the stroke. But I think he knew where he was. He kept staring at your painting in the dining room. The red one." I nodded. That painting had taken me weeks. It was abstract, bold, aggressive, unapologetic, the exact opposite of who I used to be. "He always said you were soft," she added, "that you didn't have what it takes. But you proved him wrong." I didn't respond. She stood up. "I'll go now. I just wanted you to hear it from me." She walked to the door, then paused. "You changed this place. It's not his anymore." She left. I stood in the living room for a long time after she was gone. The place did feel different, lighter. I wasn't sure what to call the emotion inside me. Not relief, not triumph, maybe peace, or the beginning of it. Later that week, I visited the rehab facility where Frank was staying. I didn't tell anyone I was coming, I just showed up. He was in the common room, staring out a window. I sat next to him. He didn't look at me. "Do you know who I am?" I asked. He didn't answer. I waited. Eventually, he turned his head. His eyes met mine. There was a flicker recognition, maybe, or regret. I didn't need a speech. I didn't need an apology. I just needed him to see me. The real me. The one who had survived him. The one who now owned the house he had ruled like a kingdom. After a few minutes, I stood. "Goodbye, Dad," I said. "I hope you find peace." As I walked away, I felt lighter than I had in years. Not because he had changed, but because I had. I was no longer the girl at the table. I was the woman who had built something stronger than any slap could destroy. In the weeks following that visit, I didn't think much about Frank. I didn't dwell on what he remembered or how he felt. I had spent too many years orbiting his moods. Now my focus was on my life. The house on Meadow Lane became more than just a home. It became a community space. I held art workshops in the converted studio. Women from the shelter came every Thursday. We painted, we cried, we laughed. One woman, Monica, said, "You don't talk like a survivor. You talk like a leader." I told her I was both. The shift wasn't just emotional. It was structural. For the first time, I had power, and I used it with care. I wrote about my story anonymously under a pen name. My articles were picked up by a women's rights publication. Readers reached out from all over the country. Some shared their stories. Others asked for advice. I didn't offer therapy. I wasn't licensed, but I offered truth. One line became quoted often. "Owning your life doesn't always mean running away. Sometimes it means returning to the very place that tried to bury you and standing tall." Meanwhile, my brothers faded. Kyle called once asking if he could retrieve some old boxes. I said no. Dean never reached out again. I didn't mind. Their silence was its own confession. As for my mother, she sent cards on holidays. Short messages. Polite, safe. I didn't invite her back. I didn't need to. I had made peace, but I had also built boundaries. And peace without boundaries is just quiet control. Frank never spoke again. He passed away 6 months later. I didn't attend the funeral. I sent a simple wreath white lilies no card. They buried him in the town cemetery next to his parents. I visited once on a cold November morning. I stood at his grave and said nothing. That I felt was fitting. I walked away with dry eyes and a warm coat. On the drive home, I looked in the rearview mirror at the fading trees and whispered to myself, I am not afraid anymore. And I wasn't. Months after Frank's passing, something strange began happening. People in town who had never looked twice at me started stopping me on the street. At the grocery store, the pharmacist, even at the post office, someone would say, I read your article, or I heard what you did for the shelter. There was a shift, a quiet reparation. The same town that once gossiped about me behind my back now nodded with a kind of respect. One afternoon, the mayor's office contacted me. They were launching a community program for domestic violence prevention and wanted me to speak at the opening. At first, I hesitated. I wasn't sure I wanted to be a public face for what had once been my private shame. But then I thought of all the women who were still afraid. I thought of myself at 24 hiding bruises behind scarves. I said yes. The night of the event, the auditorium was packed. I stood on the stage under hot lights and told the truth. I didn't cry. I didn't flinch. I spoke with the same strength I had found that night at the dinner table. I ended with this. Some people inherit home's money or legacy. I inherited silence, and I broke it. So if you're sitting in this room thinking no one sees you hear this, I see you. And one day, you'll see yourself standing on solid ground too. The audience stood. There were tears, applause, hugs from strangers. That night I went home and stood in my kitchen, the same kitchen where I had once been belittled for making the wrong dinner. I brewed tea, turned on jazz, and looked out the window at my backyard. It wasn't just a house anymore. It was a symbol. I wasn't just a woman who got away. I was a woman who reclaimed. And slowly, that truth rippled outward. Years passed. The town changed, and so did I. My hair grayed naturally, and I wore it with pride. My daughters grew into remarkable women, each fiercely independent, deeply empathetic, and unafraid to speak their truth. One became a social worker, the other a writer. On Mother's Day, they gifted me a leather-bound journal with the words, "She built her own house embossed in gold." Inside, they'd each written a letter. My youngest said, Mom, we didn't just survive because of you. We thrived because you showed us what it means to rebuild. You didn't just get out, you brought us with you. That night I sat on the front porch with a glass of wine, thinking about how far we'd come. My house, once a symbol of pain, was now filled with laughter, music, and freedom. We hosted gatherings, potlucks, holiday dinners, birthdays. My home became a safe place for others, just as I had once wished someone had done for me. Occasionally, I still ran into Frank's old friends. A few apologized, some didn't. But it no longer mattered. My validation didn't come from their remorse. It came from the life I had built with my own 2 hands. And sometimes, at night, I'd walk through the house barefoot, touching the walls I once feared to lean against. There were new memories in those walls now. Not the echoes of slamming doors or shouted insults, but the hum of a home filled with peace. I left my story behind for others in that journal, in talks I gave at schools and shelters, and eventually in a memoir. Not because I wanted revenge, but because I believed in legacy. I believed the cycle could end with me, and it did. I was no longer the woman they laughed at when he hit me at the table. I was the woman who now owned that table and the house it stood in. Oh,